Well, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of motor learning and adaptive decision making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to advance law enforcement training, make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. John Azar-Dickens. Dr. Azar-Dickens is a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in forensic and police psychology and a licensed psychologist in Georgia. While maintaining a private practice, he continues to develop and deliver training as a partnering instructor for Force Science. His law enforcement programs are taught throughout the United States and Canada, covering human performance and use of force encounters, advanced de-escalation, crisis management, mental health issues, and officer wellness. In private practice, Dr. Azar-Dickens conducts forensic psychological evaluations in support of attorneys, agencies, and judicial systems. These evaluations provide insight into violent tendencies, sexual offending, psychopathology, parental fitness, and child custody risks. Dr. Azar-Dickens also practices in police psychology, providing support to first responders involved in critical incidents, conducting fitness for duty evaluations, and administering pre-employment psychological evaluations. Dr. Azar-Dickens is uniquely qualified to address the challenges faced by first responders. In addition to his clinical practice and training programs, he's been a police officer for the city of Rome, Georgia, serving as a police officer since 2011, and he is currently assigned to the department's Selective Enforcement Unit. Dr. Azar-Dickens holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Psychology, a Master of Science degree in Exercise Science and Health Promotion, a Master of Science degree in Clinical Psychology, and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Clinical Psychology. He is the author of the just-published book, The TEB Model, A New Approach to Crisis Assessment and Intervention. Dr. Azar-Dickens, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate you having me here.
Well, absolutely. This has been a long time coming. We've been excited to have you on to talk about de-escalation and especially your TEB model and your new book. But first, before we get into the TEB, John, I think it's an interesting story as to how you went from a private clinical practice as a psychologist into law enforcement as a serving police officer. That's interesting combination. What was the history on that? How did that happen?
Well, as a forensic psychologist, I'm in court a lot, and I see I get to meet a lot of police officers who would be bringing inmates to forensic hospitals, and so I get to talk to officers about their arrests and what they did, and just became really fascinated with law enforcement just by interacting with officers, and wanted to do more in that area, but I knew that my knowledge base of police was pretty limited other than what I've seen on television. So I knew that if I wanted to work with police, my whole adult life I'd been in school, and so I thought, well, the best way to really learn what policing is about is to go to an academy. So I think my initial thought was I would just go to the academy kind of to audit it, just to see what it's like and what it's about. I don't know that when I went in, I thought I would actually have the opportunity to police. But when I was in the academy, departments were coming in and recruiting. The city of Rome came in and talking with them. I was able to be employed by them part-time, which I didn't even know that existed. And so I thought, well, what better way to learn it? If I really want to understand policing, what better way to understand it than to actually do it? And so I went through the field training process and got on the road and have loved it ever since. I think it was probably one of the best things I ever did. I didn't know this going in, but now at this point, it was probably one of the best things I ever did in helping me be a better forensic psychologist, quite honestly. Because now I hear things people tell me, and it means something completely different than before I was a police officer. Especially in regards to deception and things like that. I've learned a lot being on the road.
So did you ever encounter, like I can imagine, is my response as a police officer if I knew we had a licensed psychologist, clinical psychologist who had become a police officer, and I was dealing with somebody who was maybe difficult to deal with and agitated. I'd want to get on the radio and say, hey, let's get that psychologist over here and come talk to this guy. Were there officers who kind of thought that you had some magic pixie dust as a psychologist, you could come and talk to people?
Yeah. Actually, well. Here's the thing, and this is interesting you asked that question because that's kind of what led me to the concepts that we're going to talk about today. Was because, well, first of all, I had said to the other officers, look, I'm not a psychologist here. I'm a police officer, just like you. I don't want to be treated any differently. I don't want to get all the mental health call. I mean, I want to be a cop. And they were, and that was the case, and that happened. But every now and then, something would come up, and they call me Azar. They'd say, let's get Azar over here for this. But they would think that I would have some magic words, something I could say or do that would be different than what they were saying or doing, or that I would know something magical that would solve the problem. And that's really what started to lead me towards some of these ideas that we'll talk about, because the idea that as a psychologist I could then just magically become a police officer, that's not true. I mean, those are completely two different professions. And so what I was seeing was the mental health professionals saying to police officers, hey, look, you need to be more like us. You need to learn all of these different diagnostic labels, and you need to be applying that information on the road and using that to then inform your decisions about how to deal with somebody in crisis. And I was thinking, that doesn't work. I can't, when I get out with somebody in the middle of the night, I don't know any more than you do. And I don't know what's causing whatever the issue is that is presenting itself. I don't have the background. I don't have medical records. I don't have all the things that I would have in a hospital or even in my private practice. And so, and with some people, as you well know, it doesn't matter what you say or how you say it. They're not going to comply. And so, does my area of expertise help me in some capacity? Sometimes, but in a very limited way when it comes to policing, quite honestly.
So was it your experience then as a police officer that kind of ignited your interest, your professional passion in this area of communicating with people in crisis, communicating with difficult people? Did you see that there was any kind of really a disparity between what you were seeing being presented to police agencies as to how this is from, a lot of it from psychology, as to this is how you should talk to people and address people on the street? You mentioned diagnostic labels and things like that, and we still see that all over the place in certain types of police communication training. But was it the intersection between your experience as a psychologist and then as a police officer that kind of opened your eyes to a whole area here that you felt you could really contribute as far as police communication?
Well, what became immediately clear to me was that, it's a whole different playing field. And I remember this moment like it was yesterday when I first was on my own. I got through field training and was on my own, and I'm answering a call at 2 o'clock in the morning behind a building or something and there was one incident with a very intoxicated, very belligerent man, and it was just me. And I just remember thinking at that moment, this is real different than in a hospital where I'm dealing with a belligerent patient. It's a whole nother game. And so, I began to see, number one, how difficult this is. In a hospital, I have 4 walls, I have lots of psychiatric medicines, I have orderlies, because I would always hear mental health people say, well, you need to be more like us, we're the experts on dealing with people in crisis. And I would just sort of laugh because I would remember my days in the hospital. Whenever somebody would go off on the unit, you'd look around and say, where did all the psychologists and psychiatrists go? They're hiding in their offices, and they're saying, when they calm down, then I'll talk to them. We're going to let the orderlies deal with this, and then we'll have them when they're nice and happy and medicated in our offices. And I was thinking, we're good at certain things, but when it comes to dealing with somebody in an open environment where there are no walls, there are no medicines, I don't know you, Because, the other thing in the hospital, before I ever saw you, I had oftentimes reams of background information to look at. I knew a lot about you. I also knew you didn't have a weapon. I knew you had nothing. I didn't have to even think tactically in an environment like that. I didn't have to necessarily worry about you trying to kill me with some weapon. And so I immediately realized this is a whole different world out here. And then trying to apply the skills that we might use in a hospital environment to the police setting, it just didn't make sense. I mean, I wasn't thinking about people diagnostically when I would see them. That was never crossing my mind. I was watching and trying to watch what I was seeing to inform my decision making, not thinking diagnostically. Because what's the value of that really? Because that's not what diagnosis is even made for. That's not the purpose of it. And so I immediately began to realize, and I was hearing mental health people and others telling the police, well, you need to de-escalate everyone. You need to be knowledgeable about whether or not this person is mentally ill. And then if they are, your approach needs to be different than if they're not. Now some of that is valid. But my question always was, well, how if I can't tell what's causing this or even what's going on with this person, how can officers know? I mean, I spent my whole adult life learning how to be a psychologist, and I've been doing it now for nearly 30 years. I still get stumped when I see certain people. I don't know what I have to really think about, and even get consultation from others and say, look, I've got one that I can't figure this out diagnostically because it's so complex. For us to then say to police, well, we're going to give you some labels, and you're going to be able to recognize it, and the expectation is going to be that you're going to recognize it, and then that's going to inform your decision making about what to do. I was hard pressed to find that valid at all, and I wasn't thinking that way, and I wasn't policing that way, and so I thought we were sort of setting officers up for problems, not only in the ill preparing them to deal with people in crisis, but also if they started learning these labels and all these clinical words, and they start putting those in reports. And then they can't really explain, or if they go to court, they don't know what a lot of this stuff means in terms of depth. I thought we were setting them up for some problems. And so, but then I ran into another problem in my thinking, which was, well, if I don't think that the diagnostic system is a good system in dealing with a person in crisis in a policing role, then what else is there? I have to have an answer to this. I can't just say, well, I think this is a bad idea. And so I started thinking about, well, what is a diagnosis anyway? It's nothing more than a variation in a person's thinking, their emotion, and their behavior. And so why don't we skip the labels and get right to the foundation of the diagnosis itself? And what I always found to be important was, is this person's thinking logical and rational? Can I reason with this person? Do I see evidence of a lot of emotion here or not? And then behavior-wise, are they complying with me or are they not complying with me? Those three areas really give me what I need to then decide, is this person in a crisis? And if so, okay, well, that's going to inform my decision-making about how I'm going to talk to them. Versus, is this somebody who just doesn't want to comply, who doesn't respect my authority as a police officer, and who's just not going to do it because they don't want to? The other thing I was seeing was officers giving very directive commands to someone whose thinking was very disorganized, or what we would call in the clinical world psychotic. Somebody who didn't even know who they were, or where they were, or they were being influenced by some sort of delusional thinking. Then officers are trying to give directives and the person's not responding, and they weren't clear on why the person wasn't responding. They were seeing that responding, or that failure to respond, as more of an evidence of defiance, when really it may have been because this person wasn't processing the information they were given, or couldn't take the choices they were being given and make any sort of solid decision. And so, again, when you start throwing out labels, that becomes complicated, because the question then say, okay, what am I going to do with this? Okay, let's just assume this person has schizophrenia or something. What does that mean? What does that mean? It doesn't give us any sort of framework in directing us in how we're going to talk to this person, and how we're going to interact with this person. The other thing that I was really concerned about was, and this really started becoming more prominent after 2020, which was, hey, we're going to de-escalate everybody. And then we started seeing incidents where officers would try to de-escalate psychopaths, criminally minded people, and essentially give that person the weapons that they needed, which is time, to formulate a strategy of how they would then attack the officer. And if you look at the data on officers that are killed, what we see oftentimes is that this whole idea of create space, create time, whatever, can backfire, because what these offenders are often doing is assessing us, and they're watching us, and they're strategizing on how they're going to escape or attack or whatever. So the purpose of the model was to not only help officers recognize when they're dealing with somebody in crisis, but more importantly, when you're dealing with somebody who's not in a crisis state, because I'm going to talk to them differently than I am to somebody who's in a crisis. So when you talk about how did my police experience inform my decision making about all of this, I mean, it completely changed everything in terms of the way I look at it. And I realized, I thought police need their own model that needs to be different than what psychologists and therapists and the mental health world is using. Now, I'm not saying that diagnostic work is not important. If you're an officer, let's say, whose responsibility is to go out in the community and work with individuals with mental illness, help them find resources, help them get into treatment and what have you, I mean, then it makes sense to really maybe put more effort in training those diagnostic labels, because you're going to see a lot of that and you're going to need to have some understanding of it. But for the line officer who's working patrol, trying to make a decision about what to do with this guy who I've just driven up on, who's screaming and hollering, I don't think we were training in the right direction by just hammering him with labels.
Right. Now, when you said earlier, you said you wanted to come up with something that worked for cops on the street, so moving away from that whole diagnostic type of background into what we're going to talk about today, what you came up with. I mean, you've been teaching, John, for Force Science. You've been involved in instructing the realistic de-escalation course. In fact, you developed the content of that course specific to what we're going to be talking about today. And you spend a lot of time during that course talking to students about this model, the TEB model, and we'll get into it in a bit. But can you basically just give us a brief overview of, so what is the TEB model? If you had to give like a thumbnail overview and explain to somebody this is the TEB model, what would that explanation be?
Well, it's just a way of thinking, or maybe even we use the word assessing an individual to recognize or to better understand that they're in a crisis state. So it sort of allows for kind of a rapid assessment of a crisis situation. And I'm not relying on diagnostic impressions or a clinical practice of assessing someone in that perspective. It's more, hey, is this person in a crisis state or are they not? It helps me kind of understand the person that's in front of me a little bit better, but it allows me to do it very quickly. And because officers don't have a lot of time, they don't have a lot of, or even limited, if any, background on the person that they're dealing with. They don't have, again, as we said, medical records, or they may know nothing about this person. And they're seeing a presentation that could be a result of all kinds of things. It could be that this person may be delusional. We'll use that clinical term, a delusion being some sort of false belief that's very strongly held despite evidence to the contrary. Maybe this person's having this because they just used a whole lot of meth, and that's created this thinking state. Or maybe it is someone with a serious mental illness, or maybe it is someone with a brain tumor, or whatever. There's all kinds of things that could potentially cause this person to be thinking in the way that they are, or behaving in the way that they are, but we're not going to have the time or the background to necessarily know why that's the case. So my thinking was, well, we need a model where that might necessarily be needed in the moment that we need to deal with this crisis situation. And so how can we inform our opinions based on what we see very quickly to then give us some ideas about how we're going to interact with this person? Because I think you would agree with this. If someone's in a crisis state, and let's say that their thinking is disorganized or they are not rational, we're going to definitely need to talk to them differently than we do to somebody who's clear-minded, who understands what's going on, who's logical, who is just simply deciding that they're not going to comply with us, then my communication with them is going to be very different. And that also means something different. If you're clear-minded and there's not a lot of emotion there, and you're just refusing to follow my directives, then that's just defiance. Versus, well, maybe you're not following my directive because you don't even know where you are, or you can't even organize your thoughts well enough to do that, or you believe that I'm there as part of a giant government conspiracy to plant a chip in your brain. Well, you're not going to be listening to me when I'm talking to you necessarily. You're going to be too concerned about what I might be doing, or how I think you might hurt me, or what have you. So, but we can't know necessarily why these things are happening. We just need to recognize what is happening, and then know the next step, which is, now how do I interact with this person to achieve whatever my police objective is? And that objective may just simply being to get them to walk from point A to point B to the ambulance to go to the hospital. So that was kind of the foundation of where these ideas came from. And then rather than, when you think about diagnosis anyway, what is it? It's just a variety of presentations of thought, emotion, and behavior. And you can open the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the kind of the book we use to diagnose. And at the beginning it says, and it defines a mental disorder as a variation of, or an abnormality in thinking, emotion, and or behavior. Any of those three. Well, let's skip all the diagnostic stuff and go right to the basis. What do I see in terms of thinking? What do I see in terms of emotion? And what do I see in terms of behavior? Now, for the model, I tried to simplify it because I didn't want, officers have a lot to deal with. When somebody's in front of me, I'm having to have tactical considerations. I'm thinking about the environment. I'm thinking about what I'm seeing with the person also. So I wanted to make it very simple. So in terms of thought, we broke it down to two things. One is in the question that the officer would ask himself or herself. Is this person thinking in a clear way? Clear meaning, are they rational? Can they reason? Can they understand who they are, where they are, what's going on with their environment? Are they perceiving the world in a realistic, accurate way? Or, and we used the word, and I created the word contaminated for their thought. Or is their thinking contaminated? Now, by contaminated, I like that term because what it says is something has contaminated their thinking. Again, it could be a drug. It could be a mental illness. It could be a brain tumor. It could be a neurodevelopmental disorder. It could be all kinds of things. I may not know, but I see that their thinking is contaminated by something. Contaminated meaning they can no longer think logically. They can't reason. Their decision making is negatively influenced by inaccuracies in their perception of the environment for whatever reason. So that's the model kind of allows us to assess thinking from that perspective. Are they clear-minded or are they contaminated in terms of their thinking? In regards to emotion, again, two simple things. Do I see a lot of emotion or do I not? Is there high emotion or is there no emotion? So when we talk about high and low, so is this person angry? Are they screaming and hollering at me? Are they yelling? Are they scared? Oftentimes we'll see people whose thinking's contaminated and they're horrified because they think someone's trying to kill them or trying to poison them, or they truly believe that's happening. And so we have a contaminated thought process in the context of somebody who's full of emotion, because that's something that really guides us also on how we're going to communicate with them and kind of what our goals are and what we're trying to target in helping with the crisis situation. And then lastly, in terms of behavior, again, two simple things we're looking at. Is their behavior compliant or is it non-compliant? And so what the model does is it looks at those three areas of thought, emotion, behavior. And then based on what we are assessing there, it kind of gives us some guidance on these are the risk factors here. These are the things we need to be paying attention to. The next step is, and it guides us on how to communicate with that person. And then also we looked at volatility risk too, which I really like, is how unpredictable is this person based on what we're seeing. Not necessarily, we don't, violence could certainly be considered as part of that, but it's not a violence assessment. It is just a unpredictable, volatile assessment or volatility assessment. And I like that because it gives some indication on, there's certain presentations of thought, emotion, and behavior where the volatility of that individual is very high. versus the way someone's interacting in terms of thought, emotion, behavior, and the volatility would be significantly reduced. Now, we're always going to be mindful of a potential for a unpredictable reaction from someone. And also, we're going to be mindful that people may pretend, they may demonstrate compliance in order to lure the officer in to then attack. And we're going to be mindful of that. But let's just say, for example, I'm dealing with somebody who's clear-minded, there's not a lot of emotion there, and they're compliant. This may just be your average citizen that I'm having contact with. They're going to be much less volatile than someone who has contaminated thinking, whose emotion is very high, who is non-compliant. They're going to be very volatile, very unpredictable. And so the model kind of guides us on that volatility risk also, that I think is important.
Sure. Now, what about, you mentioned emotion before. So do you address, or how does an officer deal with feigned emotion? We often will deal with people who, and it, like you can just tell when somebody is faking emotion, like they're faking trying to be upset or distraught or angry or whatever. How is that different than like genuine emotion in the TEB profile? Where do you fit that in?
That's a tough one, because I often ask myself, how, those of us who've been around a while, whether it be doing policing for a long time or doing what I do in forensic psych for a long time, we can just sort of feel it. And so, we've had this discussion before, and I've really done a lot of thinking about trying to, how do I, and I've looked into the research on this and tried to understand, how do I know what I know? How do I know inside when this is not real emotion, and how do I define what I know? And I've never really been able to come up with a great explanation for that. Because I know from your policing experience, you could interact with somebody and you had a gut instinct that would say, this is not real emotion. How do we train that in our young officers coming out into the street? The model doesn't separate that out. And I think it takes a very sophisticated person to be able to feign at a level that would be not immediately noticeable. Now, some of our more sophisticated psychopaths can certainly do that, especially the higher functioning ones. And so I think a lot of it comes from just experience, maybe just open discussion about that as a possibility. So, for example, if I were teaching the model, one of the protocols or one of the profiles is somebody who is clear-minded, who is low emotion, who is compliant. Well, you're asking me about high emotion, but let me just use that one for example first. What we want officers to understand is that might be a very compliant citizen. That's just your average person you run into on the street that is being compliant, is interacting with you. But it also could be somebody who you've just done on a traffic stop who's feigning that compliance or using that compliance as a way to lure you in. So what they want you to say to yourself is, oh, this person's okay. I don't need to worry about them. They're going along with me. They're being compliant. Criminally minded people, psychopaths or what have you, will use that. That's a tool they will use to try to attack, waiting for you to let your guard down. So I think your question has to do with, can someone do that with emotion? Maybe to lead us to believe they're suffering from some sort of, or they're in a crisis state when they really aren't. I don't see that a lot, quite honestly. I see the compliance. I see the use of the compliance as a way to manipulate. I very rarely see, outside of somebody trying to pretend that they're insane for the purposes of getting out of jail or what have you, I don't see that on the street very often. And again, I think if we saw that, it would be a very sophisticated, psychopathic type person. But I don't know, you tell me, from your own experience, is that something that you would see often, and then how would they use that?
Yeah, I don't think I'd see it often. I agree with you. I think what, in my experience, what I've encountered often, I think most officers do, is the opposite. They get the person with low emotion who is not only compliant, because it seems to me, John, there's like a normal bandwidth of compliance that we expect from members of the public. But then there's these people that you spoke about that are intentionally criminally minded, that are trying to run a game on an officer to get you to lower your guard. They engage in these bizarre compliant behaviors which I've called overcompliance. Is like you didn't ask these people to do something, but they're engaging in just this bizarre, undirected overcompliance. And I think those are the kind of people that are the dangerous ones. You mentioned the research. When I read the Behavioral Sciences Unit research from the FBI, it seems to me that the majority of officers who are intentionally attacked and killed in the line of duty, that a large component of that category of people are what you're talking about, those ones who are compliant and low emotion and just trying to get officers to lower their guard.
Yeah, well, and the FBI did a great job they did multiple studies on that. And what they learned was that these predators are preying on the officers just like they're preying on citizens. And so in terms of the way they'll interact, when someone who's criminally minded wants to go out and rob somebody, what they're going to do is they're going to think about it. They're going to look for somebody who looks vulnerable, who looks easy to take advantage of. They're going to be assessing that person in some capacity. I live in Georgia, and we have a lot of trucks, and a lot of big guys. They're not going to go after the big guy in the big truck because they're going to know this guy's probably got a gun. They're going to go after, the elderly person who is not paying attention or what have you. Well, the FBI's data led us to understand that they're going to prey on us the same way, and if we're in their way for whatever reason, they may use that compliance as a manipulative tool. And so, and we have seen countless videos of officers killed who were trying to de-escalate. They're because they've been given that directive. You need to use these, active listening and these other tools with everybody. I think active listening, this as well as I do, it is fantastic in a lot of ways. It has amazing power when it's used correctly. It's kind of like medicine. There's certain medicines that do amazing things when they're given correctly to the right people. And they can be a nightmare when they're given to the wrong person. The same thing is true of these different skills that we're using and these different communication strategies. When we do it with the right person and we do it, it's fantastic. To me, that was where the hole was in our training. How are we we're not assessing anybody. We're just told, we're taught directive communication. Look, buddy, this is what I've asked you to do. This is what I want you to do. If you don't do it, you're going to jail. Or on the other extreme, we're going to use active listening with everybody. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, but also there's no assessment element to that. I mean, when I see somebody from a psychologist's perspective, a big part of what I'm doing is assessing them to then determine how I'm going to address the issues. I'm not going to treat everybody the same. So we kind of swung. Directive communication for all was problematic. De-escalation for all is problematic. There's got to be a happy medium where we're saying, okay, I'm going to assess what's in front of me, and based on what I see, that's going to drive my decision making. Now, we have amazing, and your show is an example of it, we have amazing research and depth of research on tactics and on human performance, especially now, today. We're making great strides in that. Where I still think we're very limited is in our whole crisis assessment, crisis intervention element, and what we know and what we're teaching. When you talk to a trainer today and you say, hey, they get very excited about tactics and stuff, but a lot of them, at least in my experience, they don't love the whole de-escalation, crisis intervention thing, because I think they're given information to teach that they don't, not only do they not understand, but that's not real effective. And so I think if we, and when you and I in our development of de-escalation training have really talked about the need to integrate communication with tactics. You can't separate those two things out. And so I think that my hope was with this model was trying to advance our knowledge about how to deal with someone in a crisis state and then integrate that into tactics too. Because you'll see that, I feel very strongly that this whole idea that we just ignore tactics altogether if we're dealing with somebody who has a mental illness, the idea being, oh, they're going to be fine, they're not going to hurt you. That's really scary to me. I tell people all the time, do you know how many murder cases I have of somebody with a paranoid delusion who's killed someone in response to that delusion, and this idea that if you have a mental illness, you're not dangerous at all, and even more importantly, that we would never need to use force on you, and that should be off the table. I heard that years ago in psych hospitals. When I was an intern, I remember very clearly the administration would say, look, if you use your skills correctly, you should never have to put your hands on people. And I would think, have y'all been on this unit? I mean, we're on a forensic unit with the most dangerous, violent people in the world, and you're telling me that because I have to put my hands on them, I'm doing something wrong. That's just not realistic. There's some people who are very, very sick, and it doesn't matter what you do, they're not going to comply. And that sometimes, unfortunately, it takes a whole lot of medicine to bring them to a position where they can actually comply at all. And so, I just think that the models that we were using were concerning to me. I thought we were putting officers at risk in some capacity with the de-escalation for all issue. And I thought there was a better way. And the way to do that, I think, is to help officers understand what they're seeing in front of them and then using that information to drive their decision-making about what to do next.
So if an officer is trained in the TEB, which is so thought, emotion, and behavior, and arrives on the scene, they get their first encounter with an individual, because I think it seems to me what you're saying is this was your goal. It was something that officers could do very quickly, just based upon the officer's observation of the individual's thinking, how they're emoting, and how they're behaving. And that quick evaluation would help them determine, or be able to determine, is this person either clear-minded and rational and capable of coherent thinking, or are they in a crisis? And is that the point at which, so if I determine the individual is clear thinking or in a crisis, does that then, is there a different trajectory of how I then interact or communicate with that individual based on that assessment?
Well, that's a big question. There's several things I want to say. First of all, it's not just even when I see them. The other thing I liked about TEB is that I already can have a profile formulated in my head from a dispatch. So, for example, let's say the dispatcher says to me, I'm being called somewhere, and the dispatcher says there's a man outside of a convenience store, and he's acting odd, he's saying weird things, he's screaming and hollering, and he won't leave the store. I already have a profile. I have somebody who more than likely is contaminated thinking. If they don't know who they are and they're speaking nonsense or gibberish, then chances are their thinking is contaminated. They're screaming and hollering, so we have high emotion, and they won't leave the store, so they're non-compliant. So en route there, I already know that I'm likely going to be dealing with somebody in a crisis state. So, but on the other issue, a person in crisis doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who's only contaminated in their thinking. They might be clear-minded, but they also may be high emotion. We've seen a lot of cases where there's a great video out of Orlando. I think you've seen it, where the officer stops a woman and she is just yelling at him as soon as he's walking up to the vehicle. And she's saying, "You stopped me because I'm black. You were profiling me." And then he's trying to engage with her. It eventually ends into an argument where they're arguing back and forth. But she's making a logical argument, even though I might disagree with her, or that officer might disagree with her. There's nothing contaminated about her thinking. Her emotion has not led to that point, but there's still high emotion. He's asking her for things, and she's complying. And so in a case like that, you have somebody who's clear-minded, they're compliant, but it's that high emotion that really puts them in that crisis. She's in a crisis because of that flood of emotion. And so what that says to me is, I need to use other strategies like active listening. I need to listen to her. I need to recognize or acknowledge her anger, rather than immediately jumping into giving directives. Because if I do that, what's going to probably happen is I'm going to have an argument. This is going to turn into an argument and in a yelling match, basically. And so she's still in a crisis state, but her thinking is clear, and that's possible. Some people are able to, they will experience high emotion, but still maintain the ability to think logically. And so if I just take a few minutes and just listen, and say, I recognize that you're very angry. I recognize that you believe I stopped you for this reason, as a means of trying to bring that emotion down. Then we can move more into a discussion of, and more of a directive kind of interaction. Because some might argue, well, why? Just tell her just write her a ticket. Just tell her what you want her to do. That's certainly a possibility, but you run the risk of escalating it by engaging in a power struggle or an argument. So we're really looking at thought, emotion, behavior collectively and making a decision about if someone's in a crisis state. And then if we don't, and then that also guides us on what are our barriers. So in this woman, for example, my barrier is high emotion, But what I have to my advantage is she's still reasonable and logical in her thinking. I'm going to use that. That's good. Versus a more difficult case would be somebody whose thinking is contaminated, they have high emotion, and they're non-compliant. Those are our most difficult people to deal with. They're our most difficult on the street. They're our most difficult in jail. They're our most difficult in hospitals, where you can't reason with them because their thinking's contaminated. You're dealing with this high emotion, whatever it is, and they're non-compliant. You've got three barriers in front of you that you're trying to have to work through. And that's a whole lot more complicated than someone who's just angry. But regardless, from an assessment perspective, both of those situations would reflect somebody in a crisis state. Does that make sense?
No, that's very helpful. And so in the TEB model, and for our listeners, John has done a great service in putting a visual of the TEB model in his book, which is super helpful. But you talk about approach styles. So you've got thought, emotion, and behavior. So an officer's assessing those three universal aspects of human behavior, thought, emotion, behavior, which then helps the officer dictate what is likely going to be the approach style that's going to be required or most effective here. And you've broken approach style down into either crisis communication, into task-focused communication, or directive communication. So why don't you just take a few minutes, John, and just walk us through each one of those three, and maybe give us an example. So what is crisis communication, or what might that look like? Task-focused and directive communication.
Sure. So what you'll notice in the model, if you're looking at the profile itself, you'll see that the first six profiles reflect somebody in a crisis state. And so a crisis can be brought on by all kinds of things. It could be contaminated thinking. It could be high emotion. Any of those is possible. But when we talk about crisis communication, basically, quite simply, what we mean is any form of communication designed to try to reduce the intensity of that crisis. If your emotion is so high that you've now lost the ability to think or to reason, my communication with you needs to be initially directed toward trying to bring that emotion down, to bring the frontal lobe, so to speak, back online, if I can. I might not be able to. If you're someone who's seriously mentally ill or high on meth or whatever drug you're on, and you've lost the ability to think logically, I may not be able to help you get that back. It may not come back, at least in the time I'm with you. It may take a medication to do that, or time. But what I can do is I can communicate with you in a way that would help reduce the intensity of the crisis that's in front of me, so that we can achieve whatever our objective is. My objective might just be to get you to move from in front of this store and talk to this paramedic about going to get help, or something like that. So in a case like that, when we talk about crisis communication, we're saying any form of communication designed to reduce the intensity of the crisis. And so the strategies like active listening, which is a very important tool, where I am letting you know that I'm listening to you. And I'm going to acknowledge, for example, I'm going to recognize the emotion that's there. I'm going to say to you, I can see that you're scared. I can see that you're angry. I hear that in your voice. Let's talk about what you're scared about. Tell me what you're angry about. Tell me what's happened to you today that has led you to feel this way. I really want to understand that. And my goal there is to try to build some empathy with you, or show some empathy, to try to build some rapport. So that we can get to the point where then maybe you will consider the recommendations or the suggestions that I'm going to give you. That's very different than directive communication. So in a directive interaction, it's, look, here's what I've asked you to do. Here's what I expect for you to do. And here's what happens if you don't do it. Or, hey, I'm going to give you two choices. So we'll say the example of, and you hear officers often say this, and I've certainly said it. Look, we've got you on a very minor thing here. I'm going to take you to jail, and you're probably going to get out before I get back in the car. And it's real simple. But if you fight me, or if you resist this, it's going to lead to more charges. It's going to create a whole lot more trouble for you. So, you decide which way you want to play this. And most logical, reasonable people would say, I think I'm going to stop because I want to go home tonight. I don't want to sit in jail, and I don't want my charges stacked up. Somebody whose thinking is contaminated, they can't take that information and weigh it in any logical way, and so they can't respond to that. So directive communication is just simply giving a directive or providing choices for this person to weigh and consider. Now, with our criminally minded or our psychopathic type people who there's no contaminated thinking, there's no high emotion. This is just somebody who's being non-compliant because they don't want to respond to our authority. I'm going to be very directive in what I'm going to do. I'm not going to give them a lot of time. I'm going to say, look, buddy, this is what I've asked you to do. You're not doing it. Let me tell you what's going to happen if you don't do it. And I always like the old verbal judo statement, is there anything else I might do to gain your compliance here? Because I've tried and you're just not listening to me. So here's what's going to happen if you continue to not listen. And then task focused is simply communication designed to accomplish a task. So if you've been in an accident and I drive up and you get out and you say, hey, officer, we had a little accident, and I hear you talking, and there's no evidence of contaminated thinking, there's no real high emotion there, and you're compliant, my communication with you is going to be solely designed to accomplish whatever tasks we're there to accomplish. There's no crisis. That's why I was always, when people would talk about de-escalation for all, I was thinking, you got to have something to de-escalate. If there's no crisis, what am I de-escalating? And so in those cases where there is no crisis, directive communication can be highly effective and is necessary, as is task focus, which is just, I'm going to talk to you and interact with you to accomplish the task. So that would be, going back to the accident example, hey, I need your license and your proof of insurance so I can write this report. Tell me what happened in this accident. And we exchange information, we communicate for that purpose, and then I write a report and it's done. So in those three cases, or those three types of communication, the big piece that's key is we're making an assessment of this person based on what we see. That's the difference between, and that's kind of an operational sort of assessment versus a clinical assessment. Diagnostic work is clinical assessment. Police are not clinicians, they're operators. We don't need to turn, and you can ask anybody that I police with, especially anybody who's trained me, they'll tell you that one of the most frustrating things of working with me is getting me out of that clinical mindset into an operational mindset, because my whole adult life I've been taught to think clinically. And it's a totally different way of thinking. And it was very difficult to shift from the psychologist role to the police role. Because, I can't go out on the street as a psychologist. I'll get killed. I can't think that way. I've got to think operationally.
Right.
So I'm going off on I'm sorry, I went off on a tangent, but your question was relationship to the types of approach style. And I think, the goal of the TEB model was to simplify this. We don't want it to be complex. And you'll also notice I don't use a lot of clinical terms at all, because we don't want officers to be stuck. We don't want to attach those clinical terms to them and then have them get in a situation where they can't explain them. Because I've heard officers many times try to use what they've been given, which is not enough. They're not given enough. They're sort of tricked into believing that you can take an 8-hour class and learn all these terms and be able to use them effectively. And you got to think, diagnostic work takes years and years and years to develop. And those clinical terms, you have to talk about them and work with them for years to really understand them. And so what I was worried about was seeing an officer on the stand, getting drilled on, you use the word delusion, define delusion, explain delusion, going into all those, or talk about the different kinds of hallucinations. So I tried to make it simple, and I made it simple not only in terms of the labels, but also simple in terms of the approach style itself.
Okay, so let me give you an example of something we see quite often, and then you kind of apply the TEB model to that and tell me what's going on and where's the mistake being made. But we often see officers who are dealing with somebody who's, I think, clearly in a crisis. They've lost the ability. They become overwhelmed by the circumstances, whatever reason. They're high emotion, and they maybe are holding a knife or something like that, or a tire iron, or some type of a weapon. And we'll often see officers standing with them at gunpoint and just yelling the same command repeatedly over and over again, like 10 times, 15 times, 20 times, and the person's behavior is not changing, but neither is the officer's. So tell me what's going on there, and how would the TEB model help an officer change their approach style to deal with somebody like that?
Yeah, because obviously that assessment piece becomes really important when I'm going to immediately try to talk to them to formulate some sort of assessment. Now, again, this is a great example because you and I have had many discussions about the need to integrate tactics with communication. You can't separate those things out. You just can't, and you shouldn't teach them separately. They're not separate. Because of a situation exactly like this, where we need to have a cover officer, we need to have a contact officer, we need oversight if this person decides that they're going to turn the knife against us and charge us or what have you. That has to be there. But it also, as a contact officer, I can make contact with this person and I can talk to them in a way to try to understand at some level what's in front of me. I might be able to know immediately if there's evidence of contaminated thinking just simply by what they're saying as we approach and as we interact. If I recognize that this person's in a crisis based on that, then I'm going to try to demonstrate some level of empathy in my communication with them to try to build rapport if I can, to then get to the point where we're going to have them put this knife down and we're going to resolve this peacefully. With the drop the knife. I mean, certainly we have to give them a directive in that situation. I mean, I think some policies require it, and especially in after the fact when they go back and look. You never asked them to drop the knife. You have to do that, but we don't have to sit there in a repetitive sort of command. We need to talk to them also. And so if we recognize there's a crisis, the idea would be, okay, I'm going to immediately engage them in some form of crisis communication, while at the same time maintaining tactical awareness. I'm not gonna walk up and put my arm around them, because they're in a crisis state. So we can do two things at the same time. We can maintain tactical excellence while we are engaging them in crisis communication, with the goal of hopefully getting them to, again, put the knife down and resolve the situation. But our danger in a repetitive directive command is that, especially if their thinking is contaminated, we don't really know what they're hearing. We don't know how they're processing what we're saying. If they're not complying, why are they not complying? Chances are that it may be, in fact, related to that contamination of their thought. Maybe they think that, the CIA is there and is going to be trying to kill them or whatever. The spies are coming in and they feel like they need the knife to defend themselves. Maybe we'll learn that as we're going forward, but at the end of the bottom line is, this is a person in a crisis state. And if I engage them in just constant directive communication or yelling and what have you, I run the risk of escalating the situation. Now, that's going to be very different than somebody who I discover through interaction that their thinking is clear, that there's not a whole lot of emotion there, and they have a knife for whatever reason, and there's no evidence of a crisis state. Then that might shift the way I'm actually communicating with them.
You have in your book, you have an outline, or you have several key concepts for officers to think about related to their approach style. You preface that by saying patience is certainly the key in interacting with individuals in a crisis state. And I think, and then you have, it looks like 10 or 12 really helpful points for officers to think about. How do I interact with these people who are in that state, and also keep myself in a state as the officer, because I think, sometimes this happens, doesn't it, where we see officers who get in that standoff state with somebody and then they start escalating their own emotion and yelling those repetitive commands, and it almost gets to the point where now we have two people in a crisis. We have the person, we have the subject, and now we have an officer in a state of crisis, and nobody is thinking their way rationally and logically through this problem. Like you said, that I think, is that where we would see this chance for this just to continue to escalate?
Yeah, and I didn't create, quite honestly, when I was building this and thinking about all of this, I didn't really think about it from the perspective of the officer. I was thinking more of assessing the subject to help us determine about a crisis state. But interestingly, over the years, officers who hear this and will say exactly what you said is, we could apply this to our own selves. We don't want our emotion to get high. Basically what you said, we don't want to send our own selves into a crisis state. Because then we got two people in a crisis state interacting with each other, and that's problematic. I didn't really think about it that way, quite honestly, when it was built. And I haven't really it's not been pursued in that direction, but I think that's really good information to think about too, is that I want to remain clear-minded, I want to keep my emotion low, and I want to interact in a way that's going to be to the benefit of this individual and not to my detriment. And what we certainly know is that when that emotion gets high, it can affect our ability as officers to then think logically and use good decision-making. And in our training at Force Science with you and the things that we've done, we've put a lot of emphasis on, talked a lot about the importance of practicing these things and training these communication strategies for the purposes of helping the officers learn how to regulate that emotion in a stressful situation. This is complex stuff. That was something I talked about in the book too, is we spend a lot of time training tactics and we're exceptional at it. But what we don't necessarily spend a lot of time training is communication and putting officers in high stress situations where they have to communicate. Because I think a lot of people think, it's just talking. How hard is it? I talk all the time. I can do that. And we teach about active listening and these other strategies. And from a academic way of thinking about it, it's like, I understand that. Okay, but you put me in the intensity of this high stress situation. Can I then not only articulate in a way I need to, but do so in a tone that's most effective? Can I shift quickly if I need to from that crisis communication type situation to a more tactical response? Those transitions, all of that becomes really critical in our training. And so at the end of the book, I go into and talk about, for trainers, how do you take this and integrate it into what you're already doing? This is not a de-escalation model. This is a piece of information that I hope departments can take and use and trainers can use and integrate into what they're already doing in terms of their de-escalation. So when you talk about emotional regulation of the officer, a lot of that comes from training it properly and putting them in high fidelity situations where they have to learn to regulate their emotion.
Right, absolutely. So we're rapidly coming up on an hour already, John, and in the time we have left, one area we haven't touched on, which I think is really important, is this aspect of suicide by cop. You talk a lot about that in the book under one of the profiles in the TEB model, about suicide by cop and where we typically see those types of individuals fall within the TEB model. And you talk about research that the San Francisco Police Department did on their actual cases and applying your TEB model to their cases. So talk to us about that. Where do we see suicide by cop, behavior or category fit within the TEB model, and how can that help officers?
Yeah, well, what we started to discover when we started working with other departments and what they would tell us too, is there was one specific profile where that suicide by cop issue seemed to always fall, and where the subject was, and that was contaminated thinkers with high emotion who are non-compliant. And when San Francisco, they have a really amazing crisis intervention team, and they do an annual report every year, and their interest in the model was, who is it that de-escalation does not work with? Generally speaking, what profile seems to show that, but also suicide by cop specifically. And so I think I incorporated 3 or 4 years of their annual report. They found the same thing over and over again, that when they were able to identify this situation as a suicide by cop situation, 100% of the subjects fell into that contaminated thinker, high emotion, non-compliant profile. And so that is very informative for the officer. So let's say I'm dispatched to a call, and I'm able to kind of assess just from the dispatch that this is probably the profile I'm going to be dealing with. One of the things I might want to think about is this: that's a possibility that I may be approaching somebody who wants to die and who's going to try to use me for that purpose. Now, you have, in some of your trainings, done a really nice job of illustrating other warning signs. And so this is just an additional piece of information that I can use in kind of warning me about that potential. The other issue I think we need to mention very quickly is officers would often ask me, and you have asked me, the suicide by cop, or the suicide is a suicidal person, does that automatically mean they're a contaminated thinker? And so isn't it possible that somebody could be logical in their thinking, but also still want to die? And so I think we came to the conclusion that yes, there are people out there who are able to make a logical decision to end their life because maybe they've had a financial hit or they're sick or what have you. But those are not going to be the people that our officers are going to see on the street. When the officer's called to someone, chances are, if there is a suicidal situation, they are contaminated in terms of their thinking. If not, they've probably either already committed the suicidal act or were never called in the first place. So I did want to mention that, and we talk about that in the book because that gets a little bit tricky.
Right, absolutely. So we've been going for an hour, John. We're going to bring it to a close, brother, but is there anything that you wish that I would have asked that I didn't, or give you the last few minutes just to have closing comments for our listeners?
Not really. I mean, we could go on with this for hours. There's so much to talk about. My whole goal in this was officers, I had always said, and I always say this, some of the best communicators I've ever seen are police officers. And I noticed that right away when I started working the road. I've seen officers do amazing things. And I was very frustrated with hearing from people that officers are terrible at communicating, they're terrible at de-escalation, when we know that is not the truth. And so what I wanted to do was just provide another resource to add to the training and the great training that officers are already receiving. And then writing the book with the hopes that we can just continue to evolve in this area and just get better at having our own way of approaching these situations so that we can resolve these situations successfully. And that's what I hope this will do. And, I encourage anybody who sees this, reads this, hears this, and they have ideas, thoughts about how to change it, how to add to it. I'm always open to hear those things. Because this is a work in progress, always.
Right. And chapter 4 of your book, it's application for the police trainer. And for our listeners, I'll just read this brief sentence. Without consistent training, when faced with a confrontation, the officer will resort back to some primitive form of defense that is not effective. We must train our defensive skills to the point of automaticity so that when they are needed, they are applied with little thought or analysis. This is not time to think about how to respond when someone takes the swing at us. So, and I love that because, and then you go on in the whole chapter, you talk about 3 phases of TEB application that you recommend, John. You talk about the education phase, the acquisition phase, and the practice phase. This is gold for police trainers to look at. How do we make sure we're incorporating good, effective, realistic de-escalation training, incorporating the TEB model into our police training? And for our listeners, if you're not familiar with the realistic de-escalation course that is run by Force Science, strongly encourage you to take a look at that. This is the course that has been developed largely by the effort of Dr. John Azar-Dickens, and you'll learn a lot there about realistic de-escalation and the application of the TEB model. John, if our listeners want to get a copy of your book, The TEB Model, A New Approach to Crisis Assessment and Intervention, where can they get that from?
They can get it from Amazon. I think that would probably be the easiest way. It's going to be available June 30th. And so that's a few days from now. So if they just Google that title, they Google my name or put it in the search of Amazon, it'll come up. They can go directly to the publisher, which is Book Logix, and that's book and then Logix. But I think Amazon's probably the easiest way to get it.
Perfect. And by the time this podcast is released, your book will be, I won't say on the shelves, but it'll be on Amazon's shelves. So they'll be able to get it. John, how can our listeners get in touch with you? You said if they've got comments or they've got feedback to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can email me. My email is pretty simple. It's just my name. It's Dr. Azar-Dickens at gmail.com. And I respond to all my emails. So I encourage anyone who wants to throw in their 2 cents and give me their opinions or what have you. I'd love to hear it.
Thank you, John. Appreciate everything you do in both advancing law enforcement training, for your service in law enforcement as a sworn police officer, and in your work in clinical psychology. And thanks for making the time to talk to us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Chris. It's an honor. I appreciate it.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainer's Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainer's Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.